Let me introduce Christlyn to you all. She is one of the strongest voices coming out of the Caribbean. She's a former Minister of Justice of Trinidad and Tobago. She's also an advocate attorney with 25 years of expertise. In 2013, she formed a political party with the view of bringing transparent leadership that aims to be socially just and promote sustainable development to her home island of Tobago, and in her words, to give forgotten people a voice. It's a privilege to be negotiating the new normal with Christlyn Moore. Welcome, Christlyn. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Today, I'm very pleased to talk about gender and politics and politics as it relates to marginalized people, and particularly as it relates to gender, which is an area that seems remote from the corridors of power. Now, coming from the global south, there is a general adherence in the legislative norms that we know that gender equals sex. It's limited by sex. I know of no country in the global south, Adam, that legislatively affirms a third gender or supports gender fluidity. It means that persons so identifying as non-binary are not recognized in our legal systems, but they play a part in our political systems. They are a constituency. If they're a constituency, where then is their legal power? If they're a constituency, where is their political power? Where do we look for evidence of their political power? Are there legislative underpinnings to their identity? Are there leaders in this community, political leaders, political actors, legislators? Those are issues that we need to confront. Binary gender codes that divide the population into male and female, while they recognize two genders, they've been slow, these codes, to devolve rights onto women. They have been very, very slow to devolve legal rights onto women. So that we see this in various fields. For example, property ownership. 1/2 of the countries in the world still have issues with regard to women and inheriting property. In terms of the right to vote has slowly been granted to women over centuries. The Bahamas only gave women full adult suffrage in 1962, Trinidad in 1918, Jamaica in 1919, Brazil in 1932. We also see binary gender codes being slow to respond to women's issues. When we look at the issue of marital rape, something that ought to be so simple, we see that Bahamas in 2020 has yet to recognize this as an issue, being constrained by perhaps other more important issues that erases this issue. Yet, of course, Bahamas, like the rest of the world, have a very strong female population represented in the numbers. So women play a part in political systems. They're a large constituency, but we see that legal systems, political systems have been slow to bring women into a complete fold. So if they're a constituency and political power is in part withheld, and legal power is in part withheld, where then do we go? Because we are confronting, particularly now in a coronavirus atmosphere, we are confronting some very stark realities. We are looking at a region, the Caribbean region, where we have one female prime minister. We are looking at the continued policing and regulation of women's bodies and women's reproductive rights throughout the region and throughout the global south. We are looking at gender bias and workplace discrimination. And as COVID unfolds, we are looking at more and more instances of domestic violence and spousal murder. The inherent danger for constituencies like these, marginalized constituencies that comprise of LGBTQ persons who are not fully recognized in the law, and women who are partially recognized in the law. The difficulty here is that they are either legally invisible or politically unrewarded. These combinations, that is legal invisibility in particular, and lack of political reward or lack of political acknowledgement cements several fallacies into the narrative. It supports a narrative, for example, that these constituencies, these unrepresented constituencies, that they are outliers, which of course we know is not true when women make up roughly 1/2 of the world population. The other fallacy that not bringing these groups into mainstream supports is that these groups are in fact adequately represented both by the political structure and by the legal structure. Again, we know this is untrue. We know this is untrue because women still in these regions do not have bodily autonomy. They do not have legal rights in all spheres. They are still denied the rights to land. They are still policed when it comes to rape, rape of minors, rape of wives, etc. The other fallacy that the lack of inclusion supports is that these groups are the maximum limit of the possible rights recognition. So there are no more rights that could be perhaps devolved. Again, this is a huge fallacy because it suggests that there's a limitation of rights and there's a list somewhere and it's been maxed out. And one of the more dangerous fallacies that the lack of inclusiveness promotes is that these groups are an academic abstraction or an aberration or an abomination, so that they are not worthy of rights because they are either so small or so radical that they are a fundamental threat to the society that we know. These concepts, these fallacies, underpin and sustain legislative discrimination. So for example, the fallacy of the shrew, the fallacy of the unhinged woman underpins, in my view, the legislative argument for provocation as a partial defense for spousal murder. This defense in turn signals that provocative words can be reason to kill a spouse and mutes the horror of spousal murder, so that these fallacies have knock-on effects. They cement in the society a norm that is not a norm. They cement in the society a view of a political group, and they cement in the society not only acceptance of the legislative response to these groups, but they also telegraph to the society what is an appropriate non-legislative response to these groups, oftentimes to the inherent danger of the societal code in general and these groups specifically. Now, another example of this permeating dangerous fallacy can be seen in the concept of homosexuality as abhorrent and dangerous to stable society. This in turn will underpin legislation that not only polices bedrooms, but that informs everything from immigration policy to workplace protection to domestic violence protection. So again, you have a fallacy that informs legislation that also supports the initial fallacy. These fallacies also act to keep these groups out of the corridors of political power by reducing them to stereotypes or tropes: unstable, incapable, dangerous, abhorrent, aberrations. And again, what you have is a large sector of society that is not able to find its reflection in the legislation, and it's not able to find its reflection in the policy, it's not able to find its reflection in the corridors of political power. Notwithstanding the fact that these groups actually support political movements, women are the bulwark of political groups around the world. So that what then is our response? How then are we to make the shifts in these margins to harness the power that the groups inherently have? Because we have to remember that whether or not political power is devolved to these groups, whether or not legislative recognition is granted to these groups fully, they continue to participate in the political process. And once they continue to participate in the political process, they have an opportunity to influence political outcomes, not simply party political outcomes, but tangible gains that can change the outlook for this group, that can change the rights currently enjoyed by these groups. Now, these issues are not simply a Trinidad and Tobago issue. They are issues that persist around the world and persist, in the global south. So we are suggesting that we have to confront these issues because the consequences are not simply a lack of diversity in your cabinet. It's not simply that. The failure to confront marginalized groups by reflecting their image back to them in the legislation and in the politics, the effect of that can be murder. The effect of that can be unsafe health practices. The effect of that can be a person feeling that they have no choice but to migrate, and ultimately that does not support the growth of your particular country, of your particular region. So what then is our response? What I have found as a legal actor and as a political actor is that when confronted by marginalization, you have some options within the system. The first one is to pretend that you're a virus and replicate, right? So that we are consumed with viral culture because we are now an internet culture. But I am talking about replication on a grassroots level, so that a two-member group may well be advised to form a chapter of another two members, and another two members, and another two members, because the replication means that your view, your voice, your basic theology has an opportunity to be carried when you are not in the room. So replication is very, very important if marginalized groups are to begin to infiltrate the mainstream with a view to changing the policy. Go low is a strategy. I know going low is not popular advice, and we have been all taught that when they go low, we go high. But in the case of infiltrating mainstream politics and mainstream law, going low helps. And going low means grassroots. It is not helpful to try to change from the top. It is not helpful, nor is it a wise use of time to try to first achieve a level of status, for want of a better phrase, and then to try to change the system. You have to go low. Grassroots organizations are the key to political change for marginal actors. And these organizations look like church groups, they look like women's groups, they look like microcredit organizations in the Caribbean, SUSUs. These are groups that bring grassroots people together, grassroots people with similar challenges, similar ideas, often similar religion, similar geographic challenges, etc. These groups, if they were to be able to realize that they are small political movements, then the challenge of harnessing the power of these groups, often these groups are already formed. The challenge now does not become a challenge of formation, but a challenge of coalition. So go low is one thing that I have observed works. Go loud is the third suggestion that I have, especially when we're dealing with marginalized groups whose voices have traditionally been stifled. The tendency has been for those groups to work in quiet anonymity, hoping to erode the structures that oppress them in the dead of night. That does not work. Groups that are marginalized need to start to consider themselves as soldiers in a very big war. And while there is room for a stealth operation, one does not generally conduct warcraft in secret. Go loud. What going loud does is that it sends a clarion call to other persons who are also fighting on other fronts in the same war. So it calls persons to your aid. Other groups, sympathizers, friends, relatives, allies from around the world, allies from the diaspora, persons who are not natural allies, but they find a commonality of purpose in your struggle. So going loud is extremely important if marginalized groups are to be removed from the margin. Repetition is important. It is important for marginalized groups to keep on message, notwithstanding the attack, so that if the message is the inclusion of women, there is a tendency for the persons who hold power to try to persuade the group to not talk about power for women, but to talk instead about family values. So in other words, to water down the message or to erase the message, that is not helpful. And it actually does harm to the movement. So repeat the message and repeat the message again and again and again and again. Complain. Complaining is a very, very powerful tool for marginalized persons. Also setting up their own systems for complaint, because oftentimes there is no mechanism in the mainstream, either the political mainstream or the legal mainstream, to accept your complaint. So it is important, in my view, for more or less parallel homegrown legal systems, court systems to grow up to protect and adjudicate over these issues that the mainstream has rejected as genuine issues. So find a way to complain. Because this is a forum that asks lawyers to put their expertise in solving these issues, we cannot ignore the obvious solution that most lawyers will come to. Sue. Litigate, litigate, litigate. If you are not recognized, then lawyers have a responsibility, I believe, to look at the challenge of the marginalized and find a legal frame to fit it in so that it can be the subject of adjudication. So there does not necessarily need to be a frontal attack on an individual for an attorney to intervene. If the issue itself is weighty enough, is meaty enough, and it really screams out for justice, I believe that our role in this society is to press the legal envelopes until we find a way to fit our package in the envelope, or for the envelope itself to be discarded as, not being fit for purpose. And finally, I would say collaborate. For marginalized people, to marginalized groups, to finally walk the halls of power and to finally see their reflection in the legislative agenda. Collaboration is needed, because quite often what we found is that our partners across the water have walked this walk already. They have done a lot of the work already, and there is no need to reinvent the wheel. But because we sit in silence and we don't partner, we lose the opportunity to work less, work smarter. Instead, we work harder. So I would encourage, as my final kind of bit of advice is that collaboration is required if we are to shift ourselves from the margins of power to the corridors of power.
Thank you so much, Christlyn. That has been really refreshing to actually have outlined for us a clear list of potential solutions, which is not something we always get from these kinds of discussions, but you've been really clear. Thank you for that. So for the people watching, this is your period now as well to comment with any thoughts you have or to ask any questions as well. So you simply just leave them in the private chat here and we'll be able to post them to Christlyn. Question I have for you, Christlyn, is, well, you've spoken really clearly about the different fallacies that underpin false arguments to keep certain groups in the margins by not seeing themselves reflected in legislative rights. And you mentioned some of the horrific consequences of that. Can you give us a real life example of the impacts you see on those human beings who are being affected?
Sure. I want to talk, if I may, about domestic violence. Around the world, there is an upsurge of domestic violence related to the COVID pandemic as more people are shut in. In Trinidad and Tobago, there is a partial defense to murder, which is provocation. And what we have seen traditionally is that where you have spousal murder, the only person who survives that is the perpetrator. And he has now the ability to say he was provoked, you know, perhaps he was called a derogatory name or so on. Now, what this does is that this cements in the mind of the public that there can be a reason for, not only can there be a reason for a man to kill a spouse, but this reason can be as trite as, those are matters that I think we have to give some clear, thought to. The other matter, the other example I may want to give with regard to that is the whole question of the fallacy, or what I consider to be the fallacy, that, you know, women do not have bodily autonomy. So that there is an absence of legislation in some parts of the world that allow women to make complete decisions about reproductive rights. That fallacy in turn leads to some horrific real world consequences that have a knock-on effect on healthcare in the various countries, because a failure to fully autonomize women's reproductive rights will ultimately cause strain on your healthcare system. So in fact, these are healthcare issues as opposed to moral issues or spiritual issues. And the state is well placed to deal with healthcare issues. So those are some of the conflated ideas that I see that really result in people paying the ultimate price, which is with their lives, because regulators have been slow, legislators have been slow, politicians have been slow to respond to parts of their constituency that perhaps are not sexy, or perhaps are considered to be outliers, or perhaps are considered to be weak, and so are not, you know, deserving, let us say, of the full attention of political actors.
And how much would you say, is it a problem that those people on the margins, and especially in those examples, women, aren't represented at the top of the political systems we have often in the global south? Like you said, I think there was only one head of state in the Caribbean who is female.
Well, one head of state in the Caribbean, I don't believe that there are a dozen in the world. And I mean, when you consider the Caribbean region is quite large. I mean, it's more than a dozen island states. To have one woman who incidentally is the only female Minister of National Security in the region. And that brings me to another point, so that even though you may have women in your cabinets, they are traditionally given the so-called gender appropriate roles. So you will have women who are ministers of gender and ministers of culture, but there are, except for the Prime Minister of Barbados, there is no female Minister of National Security in the region. I am unaware that there is even a female police commissioner in the region, and that might be a scarcity around the world as well. So that the numbers are quite stark when you look at it.
Absolutely. And the reason we're discussing how to negotiate the new normal is because of the pandemic. We all know that. And we've actually seen many of the countries that are led by women cope relatively well in containing the virus. So it is a crisis, yes, but crises also present opportunities. Do you see any opportunities arising at the moment in terms of elevating the power to be found on the margins?
I think so. I think as we look at how women who do hold these positions, a few women who do hold these positions have responded, I think this provides an opportune moment for our women, for our marginalized women to become reinvigorated, to use the tools, some of the tools I've articulated and other tools to press themselves to the forefront of these lines. Because at the end of the day, women are in leadership positions in their day-to-day lives. What the problem is that these leadership roles are not recognized. They are not valued. They are not identified. But when you consider in the Global South, most households are headed by women, then you have an idea of the amount of leadership experience that the average woman has. And the average woman would come into this role, this leadership role, having learned it from the feet of her mother and her grandmother. So there is a wealth of leadership information encoded in the females in these regions for a host of reasons, colonialism and slavery perhaps being, the foundation for all that. But the end result of female empowerment at that level, at the grassroots level, cannot be naysayed, cannot be gainsaid. So now I believe is the opportune time for women to press themselves forward unapologetically and to start, creating small viral organizations that together will either propel or stop the current political norms that we know, because a redirection is certainly needed.